Who really killed Jesus? Everyone says the Jews or the Romans. But who exactly? Let's take a closer look and solve the mystery of who really caused Jesus' death. First thought, the Pharisees. In the Gospels, Jesus' opponents. Who were they? 2nd century BC. Judea under the boot of the Greeks. Hellas imposed its gods and lifestyle. For some Jews, tempting, new, exciting, they drifted away from God. But the Greeks went too far. King Antiochus IV Epiphanes banned Jewish practices. And then he did something unimaginable. He desecrated the temple in Jerusalem, the only place of worship. He set up an altar to Zeus. He offered a sacrifice of a pig. For the Jews, the ultimate humiliation. And that's when the Pharisees were born. Their mission? Fight against Hellenization, wandering teachers. They taught everyone, rich and poor, protected the faith, reminded people of the covenant. They kept Israel's identity alive. So, despite the stereotype, the Pharisees were actually pretty cool. What was their stance toward Jesus? Surprisingly, the Pharisees and Jesus taught about the same things: resurrection, angels, eternal life, the Messiah. Disagreements, mainly about interpreting Moses' law and how to follow it. Plus, Nicodemus, a Pharisee, followed Jesus. Gamaliel, a Pharisee in the Sanhedrin, defended his disciples. But let's not make it all sweet. There are passages where Pharisees, together with the high priests, looked for ways to get rid of Jesus. What motives could the Pharisees have had? First, authority. Jesus publicly challenged their teaching. People listened to him more than to them. That stunk. Second, Sabbath law. Jesus healed on the Sabbath. For them, that was breaking Moses' law. Third, hypocrisy. Jesus called them out publicly. He called them hypocrites, blind guides. That was a humiliation in front of the crowds, so clearly it's not obvious. We can't judge the whole faction. The question is, did they have a real direct influence on his death? Suspect number 2, the Romans. Right. The Romans actually crucified him. They nailed him to the cross. Only they had the right to issue the sentence and carry out the execution. But who were the Romans in Judea anyway? Judea was under occupation. Rome controlled politics, the military, taxes. Locals could argue about religion, but Rome had the final word. And Pilate, the key figure. Prefect, the Roman governor of Judea. Day to day he stayed in Caesarea, but came to Jerusalem during festivals. Why? During Passover, the city boiled with tension. Thousands of pilgrims, religious emotions, easy spark for revolt. Romans' view of Jesus? They didn't care. They weren't interested in Israelite religious disputes. Some probably heard of his miracles, some maybe wanted to see or hear him, but they had no reason to be hostile. Did Pilate have a personal motive to kill Jesus? Let's see. First, peace at all costs. Pilate already had reports to Rome about uprisings. Another rebellion could end his career. Jesus drew crowds. That smelled like risk. Second, pressure from the Sanhedrin. The high priests said, "He claims to be a king." For Rome, that sounded like political treason. Pilate couldn't ignore accusations of rebellion, but on the other hand, no personal hostility. The Gospels show Pilate was reluctant. He tried several times to release Jesus. He even washed his hands, symbolically saying, "It's not my fault." Conclusion: the Romans carried out the sentence, but not because they had a personal mission. Pilate acted out of political fear and pressure. For him, Jesus was innocent, but troublesome. Suspect number 3, the Jewish crowds. Jewish society was mostly farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, merchants. They lived under Roman occupation, which weighed on them. Many were religious and believed in the promise of a Messiah who would come and free their nation. Others were less devout, but still longed for freedom. What was their view of Jesus? At first, many looked at him with hope. Maybe he was the Messiah they'd been waiting for? The crowds were drawn by his miracles, healings, and teaching. But over time came disappointment. If he really was the Messiah, why didn't he lead a revolt against Rome? Why didn't he fight for political freedom? Some may have thought Jesus failed their expectations, even that he was a false prophet. Did they have a motive? As a whole nation? Not really. Ordinary people weren't plotting conspiracies, but crowds change moods fast, first cheering, then shouting for blood. Disappointment may have turned some against him, eventually supporting his crucifixion. Suspect number 4. The Sadducees. They appeared in the 2nd century BC during the Maccabean era, mostly aristocrats and descendants of the priestly line. But not just anyone could be a Sadducee. They had to come from the line of Aaron, Moses' brother. It's about Aaron we read in Exodus, for example Exodus 28, where God chose him and his sons as priests. So they had a holy lineage, which in practice gave them a monopoly on the temple. And what did that mean in reality? They weren't just religious officials. They were the priests themselves. Only they had the right to offer sacrifices. Only they could enter the sanctuary. Only they controlled worship in the temple. In practice, they ruled over the holiest place in Judaism. If you wanted forgiveness, purification, or to fulfill the law through sacrifice, you had to go through them. This gave them not only spiritual prestige, but also enormous political and economic power. They controlled sacrifices, offerings, and the whole religious system. Who controlled the temple, controlled Israel's heart. That made them the most powerful group in the Sanhedrin. They made deals with Rome, loyalty in exchange for privileges. It worked for them. Money, power, and peace, and quiet. But common people saw them more and more often as corrupt officials. Their view of Jesus? Sadducees were priests, so you'd think their faith was the strongest. Wrong. In reality, they weren't guided by faith or spirituality. They didn't believe in resurrection, angels, or the coming of a Messiah. For them, religion was a tool of power, and the temple, a huge business and political hub. That's why Jesus was a threat to them from the very start. When he taught in the temple and won over the crowds, he undermined their authority. When he drove out merchants and overturned bankers' tables, he hit their finances. And when people started calling him King of Israel, he risked making Rome see them as disloyal. To the Sadducees, Jesus wasn't the Messiah, but a troublemaker disrupting their holy order. He threatened their power, money, and influence, so he had to go. Their motives: first, power. His popularity took away their authority. Second, money. Jesus overturned tables in the temple. Their business got hit. Third, fear. They feared Rome's reaction to news of a king of Israel. The Sadducees had the most to lose. They pulled the strings. They stirred up the crowd and pressured Pilate. Without their scheme, Jesus wouldn't have ended up on the cross. The Sadducees were like today's lobbyists, and oligarchs rolled into one. Deals with power, money from monopoly, political influence. And Jesus, he exposed their game, showing the emperor has no clothes. That's why they're the ones most responsible for his death.